The whole idea of rights and freedoms starts with a fundamental concept of individual rights, and with those rights, individual responsibilities, that you do your part to help society while never imposing your right to a right on top of somebody else's right to a right. One of the things that we had when we defined the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it evolved and it went through the courts, and the courts really struggled for quite a while when the Charter first came out. It was ultimately defined that in order to remove a charter freedom, you had to pass the Oakes test. And it established that there was a cost benefit analysis that had to be done publicly and clearly before anyone in power could remove a right or a freedom from someone.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Dialogue Over Division with our friend, Colonel David Redman. And we're on today to another important topic. I think all of these national interests that you've identified are incredibly important. And as you say, they're all intertwined. And today the focus is on rights and freedoms. And these are words we talk about a lot. And I don't know if we ever really hone in on what exactly they are, why it's important to have identified rights and freedoms. So as usual, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And maybe again, if you want to do a little summary right off the top and kind of present how you came up with your 6 national interests and why.
So thank you very much, Eva, and thanks for doing this. Back in 1967, when I was a teenager, just entering into the world, I looked at Canada at that time, and I was inspired by my country. I couldn't wait to turn 18 and walk out the door and become a participant in my country. And the path I chose was the Canadian Army. But for everybody at the time, there was this uplifting feeling. And I now have 6 grandchildren who are all between the ages of 19 to 22. And I wondered what they thought of Canada and what was their perspective looking at our country as it is today. And so I went back in time and sort of tried to get that feeling and hope that we could create that feeling for all the teenagers in Canada today. So I stepped back and I wrote a paper, and I based it also on some of the stuff that I had been taught in military college in 3rd year, which defines the national interests of a country. And I'll explain for a minute just why we did that. But the whole point is we need a vision for our country that's 25 years out, that pulls all the political process and all the citizens' aims and ambitions towards a future that's solid, strong, vibrant, and resilient. And so to try and get our youth of today to be able to talk coherently about the future. When I was in military college, we were taught in our 3rd year as young officers going out into the world, the 6 national interests that define a country. Now, I defy you to try and find that same discussion anywhere in either the political realm of today or even in business and industry. Where are they looking when they make their projections? Do they look out 25 years or do they look at this year's ending stock portfolio? And so I wanted to try and create that 25-year vision in a paper to get people so that they could talk comprehensively about a country, in particular our country, and the 6 national interests that define any country, but in specific terms, Canada. And those 6 national interests being unity, national security, good governance, rights and freedoms, economic prosperity and growth, and individual and societal well-being. And so if you can frame your country in those terms, you can hold people to account that are your leaders, but you can also have meaningful discussions with other citizens about what's happening in Canada today and how to pull it together in those 6 blocks that will ultimately allow you to define a 25-year vision for Canada. Now, I always want to point out that the first 2, the basic definition of a country, is when a group of people who have shared common interests, values, and beliefs come together in a defined geographic region which they are prepared to defend. So the first two national interests of unity and national security define a nation in simplest terms. And without the first two, all the rest fall to pieces. So once you've established that we have unity, that we have a common sense of beliefs and values in a country, and that we're prepared to defend them with all the 7 pieces of national security, then you can talk about things like good governance, which we did in our last episode, and the details of what's needed to make up good governance in real solid terms, not just in a transcendental sort of way, but in a solid bullet by bullet. This is what you need. This is how you achieve it. Are we achieving it? How can we make it better?
Mhm.
Then we're now to a democracy in true form, and we need to talk about the rights and freedoms, because you can have a dictatorship, or you can have a democracy, or you can have all the steps in between. And rights and freedoms are the fundamental discussion that we need to have to define what is a right and what is a freedom. Are they worth having? Why are they worth having? And what, as Canadians, do we believe are essential and non-negotiable?
Yeah. Well, and just to jump in here a little bit, it's just such a topic that is so important, but yet we don't talk about because, like I mentioned earlier, we throw out, I have the right to this, I have the right to that. And then obviously, we see we don't always have the right to do things that we please. And we do abide by regulations and laws. We talked about speeding last week or last episode, which is obviously one that we don't really think twice about. We've agreed to this social contract and then try to abide the best as we can to the speeding limits. But then when something like you can't go out and socialize, you can't meet with your family at Christmas, this conversation, we almost we were kind of having the conversation, but more it was just emotionally charged and divisive, thanks to our leaders, I would say, rather than having a conversation about individual responsibility versus what public responsibilities are and where and how far our rights go. So again, really interested in this discussion and hearing what it is you've come up with, Colonel
So,
Redman.
yeah. So last in a previous discussion, we talked about my definition of the circle.
Mm-hmm.
And standing at the top of the circle is an individual, all on their own in the middle of nowhere. And they have 100% rights and 100% freedoms because there's no one else around. And so they can do anything they want at any time and in any way in the manner of their choosing. And then in that circle, everybody wants to draw things left, right in a long line. I always do it in a circle because if you follow the path around that circle, no matter whether you go left or you go right, as you walk around that circle, at the bottom of the circle is a total dictatorship where every citizen is told exactly what to do, what to think, when to do, and how much they can do, and nothing more. And you do exactly what the dictator tells you. So as you walk left or right around that circle, you are intentionally giving up certain of your rights or your freedoms in order to be able to live together in a society to achieve greater things than can be achieved by a single individual. And so it's a positive thing to come together in civilization and to build with others. And so the definition then is, do you go left or do you go right? And my simple definition is, as you go further left, government becomes more and more and more industry. And as you go right, the private sector takes on more and more importance until it reaches that midpoint and starts to become government itself and takes over government. And at the bottom, you end up, no matter which way you go, with a dictator. So it's the citizen's choice how much right and how much freedom they're willing to subjugate to the majority or to their society. And at what point do you stop? What point do you say, nope, we can't go past that line? And so, as everything in a democracy, it evolves. And so we have to have constant, it's not you write it, it's done, okay, we never talk about it again, because societies evolve. And so each time we end up in these discussions where we believe government has gone too far, we try and ratchet back, or we try and have a meaningful discussion to define what is an essential right or freedom. So I want to give you another example. In 2001, the attacks of September 11th were horrific, and they caused a knee-jerk reaction in the entire Western world. And suddenly people were so afraid of this new evolved threat that they were prepared to basically throw away massive amounts of their rights and freedoms in order to achieve a little more safety. I believe it was Benjamin Franklin who said anyone who's prepared to give up a little bit of their rights and freedoms in order to have a little bit more safety deserves neither freedoms nor safety. And so the concept is how far do you go? Now, I became the director of counterterrorism in the province of Alberta, and my daily mantra to people I was working with and who worked for me was, we will never give up rights and freedoms except for the shortest period of time for the minimum amount of actual right given up, in order to ensure that the terrorists don't win, because that's exactly what the terrorists were trying to do. They were trying to destroy our open and free democracy. And so if in putting in process a place to stop terrorism, we denied all the rights and freedoms, then we had achieved for the terrorists what they had been trying to do on September the 11th and in all the other terrorist attacks leading up to September 11th and all those attacks that have happened since. So when we built the counterterrorism process in Alberta, it was always designed to ensure maximum assurance of rights and freedoms. And when you had to interrupt in order to directly stop a known terrorist capability, then it was in a tiny defined area, as small as you could make it, for the minimum time possible, with the intent to immediately restore all rights and freedoms the minute you could. That certainly wasn't the case in all Western democracies, and we've seen in the United States, for example, the Patriot Act, which now, still to this day, over 20 years later, has given the U.S. government the right to impinge on the rights and freedoms of its own citizens in massive ways. And we tried to ensure that any new legislation that happened in Canada did not do that. So that whole discussion about how much do you give up in order to achieve safety is an ongoing and evolving discussion. And I believe one that Canadians are losing because they're not involved in the discussion. And we see governments in Canada at the municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal level just assuming more and more and more powers, which totally impinge on the rights and freedoms of Canadians. I think the COVID situation was a prime example, and why I fought so diligently for 2 solid years to try and stop the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions, which I saw as A, totally unnecessary, and B, as a complete invasion of the rights and freedoms of all Canadians. One of the things that we had when we defined the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it evolved and it went through the courts, and the courts really struggled for quite a while when the Charter first came out. And it was ultimately defined, you can really help me with this. It was ultimately defined that in order to remove a charter freedom, you had to pass the Oakes test. It was based on a case involving a gentleman with the last name of Oakes. And it established that there was a cost-benefit analysis that had to be done publicly and clearly before anyone in power could remove a right or a freedom from someone. And so it was a balance in the courts of the Oakes test. I never once heard a government official or a government lawyer during the COVID crisis ever once talk about the Oakes test. I heard defense lawyers talk about it, and as you know, Eva, I testified against the government of Alberta in the Ingram case because I believe they never once met the requirements of the Oakes test for any one of the imposition of the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And just to clarify for people, there's 15 NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, and they included things like closing schools, closing businesses, enforcing social distancing, border closures, travel restrictions, avoiding crowding, all of those things that were imposed on Canadians with no cost benefit analysis and never once an Oakes test in the court. When we testified against the government, it was specifically never brought up and never discussed. The Crown never presented the cost benefit analysis to invoke any one of those restrictions of rights and freedoms.
Yeah. I don't think they can. And this will probably jump a little bit to personal wellness. Sorry, your last national interest, but I was thinking something the government could have imposed but chose not to was mandating everybody to go for a 30-minute walk every day, mandating everyone to eat an apple every day, and then you could have bylaw officers coming in and saying, "Did you go for your walk today? Oh, no, you're going to get fined." Instead, they chose which one. So yeah, we could, again, we're going to have a whole discussion on this topic because it's also another conversation that we're not having in Canada and maybe in Western society. Like our rights were taken away, people are aggrieved, people have been divided, and nobody is stepping up to have conversations about what went on for the last 4 years. So we're going to take that on as well. But let's go back to the rights and freedoms before we jump into like how the government can defend it. So why is it important to have set out rights and freedoms? Isn't it obvious?
Well, I'm afraid Canadians today don't see it as obvious. Certainly in my youth, I remember being told by my mother at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning, "Get out of the house." She wanted us out so she could clean the house. She could do whatever she needed to do. My dad was a police officer. He was at work, and we were told, "Get out and don't come back till either I blow the whistle." Now, we lived in Victoria near the beach, so we would go to the beach and she would blow this whistle at lunchtime, and that was the signal to get your butt home. But you roamed. You went through the forest. You went through the log jams. You went up and down the beach. As a child, you were taught to be independent, and the expectation is that you had free range of the world. Nobody walked you to school. You walked to school on your own. We lived in a society where neighbors looked out for children. They didn't spy and report on them, but they made sure that they never got in trouble, and they helped them if they were in trouble. Where each individual was expected to be responsible for themselves to the greatest degree possible, based on any limitations they may have, but based on the fact that the first assumption was you assumed the risk of your life and for your life, and you embraced that risk. You wanted to be out there. You were taught by your parents all the skills you needed to have the confidence that you could step out in the world by 18 and thrive as
The,
an
the,
individual. And so the whole idea of rights and freedoms starts with a fundamental concept of individual rights, and with those rights, individual responsibilities, that you do your part to help society while never imposing your right to a right on top of somebody else's right to a right. I'm sure many of our audience who are gray-haired like me will remember Red Skelton. And in one of his routines, I'll never forget it, he said, he was Freddie the Freeloader, and he was talking about human rights and his personal individual rights. And his line was, "I have the right to live my life the way I wish, right up to the point where my rights supersede someone else's rights." And I thought that was a pretty telling statement. But so he understood social responsibility, but he also started from the premise that he accepted the risk to live his own life in the way that he chose and accept the consequences for the decisions he made. And so we get back to the discussion that we've had in so many of our discussions about helicopter parenting and bulldozer parenting. We've now seen for 40 years an evolution of Canadian citizens where the individual responsibility to accept their risk caused by actions they do has diminished and diminished and diminished because they've been plucked out of situations, at first with helicopter parenting, where anything that challenged their individual going forward in the world was removed. And then we got the bulldozer parenting, where instead of removing the child from a difficult situation, we bulldozed away everyone who put any expectations on the child, their teachers, the police, the parliament, the academic institutions were bulldozed out of the way, and this child lived a risk-free life. And so we get to the point now where people understand they want their rights, but they're not prepared to accept the responsibility that comes with those rights. And they assume that whenever anything's difficult, government must solve everything for them. And so the whole idea of individual rights. So to me, there's two sort of paramount concepts: individual rights and the right to own property. So let's talk for the second one for a minute, and then we can have a more detailed discussion about what those terms mean. In Western society, when we broke the rule of kings, and it's very much going back to the time of William the Conqueror, and then back and back and back, the nobles and the king owned all the land. All land belonged to the nobles, and in fact, directly to the king. And with the Magna Carta, we saw the first smashing of that concept. And slowly but surely, businesses and then individuals and then just ordinary citizens ended up with the right to own property. So it hasn't always been something that was taken for granted, but in Western democracies, it has become a fundamental cornerstone right that you can own property and that people can't take it away from you unless you break certain rules. And so the concept of individual rights and individual property rights is a cornerstone of what made Canada. And it's why so many immigrants came to our country back in the first 300 years of our development to get that little piece of land, a little piece of land that they couldn't get in the UK, they couldn't get in France, they couldn't get in Germany because the king owned it all. And so they came here with the unbelievable ability to actually get a chunk of land. And as long as they cleared 10 acres, built a barn, and built a house, after 10 years, they owned it. Now we see that basic concept being challenged in the courts with some recent rulings in BC, where those fundamental right to own property are being removed. And so Canadians need to understand that there's individual rights, there's property rights, and they're enshrined, supposedly, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. And it was, up until recently, defended vehemently by the government of Canada. It's the federal government's responsibility to defend the Charter based on the Oakes test, and in our courts when either government or an individual or companies overstep and try and take away an individual's rights or the individual's right to own property. So we're at that point where perhaps we need to boil down some of those rights. And I think the Charter itself, again, not a perfect document, but tried to enshrine and capture all the different types of rights, freedoms, and then responsibilities. And it's right in the Charter.
So just the one thing I would mention is that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian one, also applies to the provinces, of course, but it doesn't include any property rights. So Alberta Bill of Rights has its own, and I'm not as familiar with all of Bill of Rights or charters other provinces have, but the Alberta Bill of Rights has property rights listed under its provincial charter. And that's because under the Constitution, property law is a provincial jurisdiction. So that I just wanted to clarify that a little bit.
Absolutely. And important, our confederation immediately understood, and we talked about it in national security, the vastness of our country. When
Mhm.
you're in a country that has the second largest geographic landmass of any country in the world, with the 18th largest population, you know that two things happen. Number one, you're going to need friends and allies to help you to defend it under national security. But when you talk about all other types of actions like rights and freedoms, like economic prosperity and growth, like there are such huge differences in our geography and in our concentrations of peoples in our country that we need to devolve powers to the provinces and territories and then devolve them again to the municipal order of government. And that's why we have three orders of government in Canada instead of one order of government, like in the UK, where basically the federal government does everything, including running all of the fire services, all of the police services, all of the. Canada's so huge, we simply can't do that. There's so many differences across our great mosaic of a country that we have devolved those powers, and we've done it legislatively, knowing that we needed to devolve them. And now we see the federal government trying to pretend those breakups of charter, not of charter, but of the Constitution don't exist, and are trying to step over provinces and territories and assume them. And so when we get into that, we definitely see that things like property rights and even individual rights can vary slightly as we go across our country. But at the end of the day, for individual rights, the federal government, all through COVID, should have been doing the opposite of what it was doing. It was encouraging. In fact, the Prime Minister of Canada said, if you don't do the right thing, I will withhold federal transfers. The right thing he meant was to impose greater and harder lockdowns rather than what he should have been doing, which was monitoring the breakdown of the rights and freedoms of the citizens and saying you can't do that. That goes against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You need to clearly justify each action you're taking because you're not, and demonstrate it, or I will rescind your lockdowns. So two different approaches, and we all know which one was taken and probably why. And so
Mhm.
we need to understand the relationship in Canada between the federal government and the provincial territorial governments, and then also understand, I know you do, but for our viewing audience, that the definition of a municipality is completely different in all 13 provinces and territories because the province has the total right to define the next order of government. And they've defined it in completely different ways, even in the neighbors to our left and right, where I'm in Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, but all across our country, what it takes to be a municipality, and then the definition of what's a city, what's a town, what's a village, what's a hamlet, varies all across our country because of population density. And along with it, what powers were devolved to municipal order of government, completely different. So
Mhm.
the whole discussion about rights and freedoms is bottom up and top down. And so the whole idea of what is a fundamental right? The freedom of conscience, the freedom of thought, the freedom of peaceful assembly, the freedom of association, the mobility rights, the legal rights, the equality rights that are defined in the Charter are things that Canadians need to actually learn about, read about, understand, and then understand the other section, which is what are your responsibilities for those rights and how do they link together? It's defined in the Charter. It's a good starting document and one that we can evolve. It's not perfect, but it's definitely somewhere that Canadians should download a copy, read it cover to cover, see if they agree or disagree, and if they disagree, why, and have that discussion. And if they agree, how far are they prepared to go to defend what that document says they're supposed to have when they see it being removed?
Yeah. And so, um, I suspect we're going to keep talking about these freedoms and and then responsibilities, which I think is just so important. But why do you think it's so important to have it written down? So, and like you just said, people need to go and read it for themselves. Because that was a whole controversy too to get it written down in the charter in 1982. And so why do you think it's important for it to be enumerated and explained on paper?
That's a really interesting question, and I hate when people say that that it's an interesting question, because when I was a young officer, we were taught. Okay, in 1972, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms didn't exist. We had a definition of freedoms and rights within the Canadian Constitution, and John Diefenbaker was very, very clear about it. And this whole iteration that happened later was the fear of Pierre Trudeau's government overreach when we brought the British North America Act home, and the fear that the provinces had that the federal government was going to step past its areas of responsibilities, and that there was a need to defend against federal government overreach. And so it's a whole interesting discussion. And so let me take you back to 72. When I was taught as a young officer, we were actually, it's one of those American Canadian differences. The Americans codified every right and freedom in this giant tome of a book. And as a young officer in the American forces, this massive tome, and you went through it, and there was case after case after case, and they refined each right into little tiny segments and little tiny pieces. And it was impossible to learn. When we were starting off, we were given the concept that the broad strokes of what it meant to be a Canadian in terms of rights and freedoms was that you were expected to treat everyone with respect, do unto others as you do them unto you, that as an officer you treated soldiers with respect. As an officer, you were superior to them, but you never went past the areas of the Queen's Commission. You'll see sitting on the back of my wall there, the Queen gave me the right to command soldiers, but to treat them with respect and dignity at all times. And so the whole concept of rights and freedoms was very broad based, a high level discussion, and you were expected to have the competence to interpret and to apply fairly and equitably within each of your platoons, your companies, your battalions as you went up in rank, and to the understanding of citizens' obligations to our country. Certainly coming from a generation, my mother and father both fought in World War II in uniform. And so uh, it was just this common understanding of what it meant to be a Canadian, and what it meant to have the ability to meet with people and to have freedom of and from religion. To have all those basic things were just ingrained, and they were thought of in a conceptual way, not in a list, not in a defined list that was written down. And so the iteration in the 1980s when we got to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was because of a fear that someone was going to step past, because perhaps they weren't defined well enough and they could get away with it. And now what we're seeing is a desire to even subdivide the charter into smaller and smaller pieces, where the Oakes test, in my opinion, would hold these higher level concepts very clearly quite well, all on their own. If you had to do a cost benefit analysis, and let's talk about a simple one, wearing a mask. You have to prove to me that wearing a mask will do more good than harm. You have to prove to me exactly which geographical area needs to wear a mask, because wearing masks all across Canada was insane. So whenever you're going to remove a charter right or freedom, you have to define the geographic area and make it as small as possible. You have to define exactly who you're doing it for, and prove that it will do them less harm than good. And you have to define the shortest duration of that breach possible. The Oakes test was an extremely well thought through, balanced cost benefit analysis process to ensure the charter was maintained. To me, throwing away the Oakes test by our judicial system, and we had this discussion about the good governance in a democracy in a previous session, the whole idea that the courts would uphold the charter was fundamental to defining the charter, and therefore hold individuals responsible but even more importantly, hold government responsible. And in my understanding, the reason the Charter of Rights and Freedom was written was for fear of government overreach at the federal, provincial, and territorial and municipal level, and to hold in check that reach to go back to the time of kings, where the central government defined which right and which freedom you were permitted to have, rather than assuming they're all there, and the government has to justify when they remove any one of them.
So I won't defend the judiciary a lot. I think I did a little bit the last time too, but the one thing I would say, and this goes to the COVID time and the pandemic, is what I saw judges doing is it came to them as a public health medical issue. And so like, it's not they don't learn these things in law school or in their career, generally, I would think. Something like mobility rights would be something I could see them a lot more, although that was when we talked about that last time, mootness, that one. Unfortunately, the judges said it was a moot question, which I very much don't agree with that, because like we said last time, this could come up again, and let's have some clarity around that issue. But in terms of the public health, and that's just I don't want to defend it, but I just want to highlight, I think that there was a maybe a gap or a hole, and there was an issue with the medical establishment that caused a lot of the concerns when people that raised concerns were silenced and censored. Then what I saw is judges had public health authorities versus some random expert. And I know, David, you are one of those random experts. So I'm not saying what they did was correct. I think obviously, and we're going to learn in the years to come about the problems we had, but maybe this is another conversation when we have our COVID discussion is, there's areas for environmental issues and you have arbitration in that area. Maybe that's something missing here because anyway, I'm going with the whole public health thing and we're moving away from rights and freedoms, but it just got me thinking.
They're totally related.
Okay.
And totally related to this discussion, because I want to use the Oakes test and always keep coming back to it.
Okay.
Because it was the check and balance
Yep.
to defend the charter. And without it, the charter is meaningless. All right. You can list all the rights and freedoms you want, but if nobody's going to defend them and there's no defined minimum standard, and that's what the Oakes test was. It wasn't the perfect
But it was
standard.
created. That's the other thing, through the Supreme Court of Canada.
It was created because there was a need, right?
Yeah.
It was created because every case was coming forward and being evaluated on experts' testimony, but experts never having to justify. And so if I can give Jeff Rath a shout out, one of the things when at the National Citizens Inquiry on the COVID response, Jeff did a little 30-minute session that I thought should have been broadcast to the world. And if only we had an independent media, and we talked about that in governance in a previous session, they would have taken what he said and run with it all across Canada. And a simple administrative amendment in law at provincial, territorial level, and at the federal level could correct many of the things that went wrong about experts. The difference between reasonableness in a court and correctness. Correctness implies that every time an expert walks into a room and says, and let's use a different example, an expert walks into the room and says, you can't walk in a provincial park for the foreseeable future for a time limit I will not define, but across all parks in this province because there is a forest fire risk.
Mm-hmm.
So, reasonableness, and what I see all over the social media platforms and in the Canadian legacy media is, well, of course, there's this terrible risk of forest fires. We need to stop people walking in the woods. it seems reasonable. Correctness implies that that same premier with their fire officials has to prove correctness, which is people walking in the woods cause forest fires. Before you can deny that charter right, you need to prove correctness. And why has this whole discussion come up? It's come up because experts routinely abuse their powers and can't be held accountable in the courts because the only standard they have to meet is reasonableness. And so they walk in the door and say, public health emergency. So everything that I say from now on is correct. I haven't had to prove there's even an emergency, but by saying public health emergency, by saying wildfire emergency, by saying I can deny every one of the charter rights and freedoms, I don't have to define how a small area, I don't have to find a time span, and I don't have to apply it to a reasonable small group of people. I can just do anything. And that's where the rights and freedoms of our country fall to pieces. And so I was one of the experts. I was an expert who wrote a counterterrorism plan and ultimately assisted in leading the team that wrote the pandemic influenza plan to minimize the impact on any charter right of freedom. We said specifically that the non-pharmaceutical interventions, unless proven otherwise, do far more harm than good. And so if the disease is Ebola, you can specifically target a little area where there's been an outbreak. You can restrict charter rights and freedoms in a tiny area for a tiny group of people for a very limited point of time till you smash it down. And it's over. Instead, you can also just turn around if you're lazy and say there's an Ebola crisis and the whole country needs to go in lockdown when the Ebola is in one village beside a river. Okay, so the whole concept of Charter of Rights and Freedoms is totally fragile unless you have an independent judiciary that holds a test, an ability to test that reasonableness versus correctness. When the courts seem to abrogate the responsibility, Jeff Rath's proposal was to put it in writing, to once again start narrowing and putting the scope in and say no expert can take away a charter right or freedom without proving correctness. Instead of the courts using the Oakes test to demand a proof of correctness, he said the expert has to do it at source. Probably in this day and age, even a better idea, because if they know they have to prove correctness, or they can be held guilty of gross negligence in the courts with serious fines and jail time, they'll start to be a little less free in their expert advice to infringe on charter rights and freedoms right from the source. So there's two ways to do it, through an independent judiciary or through actual legislative control on experts. Both can work, and we need to have a very serious discussion in Canada about doing it. My concern at times is if you do it right with a written plan, like we did in counterterrorism, you can see exactly how it's going to happen, and people will have a far less trouble. So let me give you an example. Through what we did in counterterrorism is we actually put a level of threat versus a level of criticality versus a level of security. And we linked them together. As the level of threat went up, it became more and more and more refined in a specific target, right? Terrorists don't just attack the province of Alberta. They attack certain pieces of infrastructure, whether they're going for a soft attack or a hard attack. And so we put predefined levels of security with every piece of critical infrastructure and said, when we tell you this level of threat, we don't have to say anything else. You're going to ramp your security up. That security ramping up imposes a restriction on charter rights and freedoms for people within a very small and specific area for a time period, which we then immediately remove as soon as we can bring that level of threat down. And so the whole concept was built on level of threat, small geographic area, defined period, no one responds. And people were totally comfortable with that because we didn't try and lock all of Alberta down if we thought there was a terrorist cell about to attack a specific target. We need to be that refined and specific in our plans for all types of hazards and share them constantly with the public and get public feedback. Is that gone too far? Is that not enough? What are Albertans prepared to accept? What are Canadians prepared to accept in every province and territory, defined on the rights and freedoms and knowing what they're going to give up and what they're going to gain? But it has to be for the minimum time in a defined small geographic area with the concept that it will be immediately removed as soon as possible with the minimum impact on rights and freedoms, the rights and freedoms of freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, peaceful assembly, freedom of association, mobility rights, legal rights, and equality rights, right? The things that are in the charter. And we need to make that clear and have that discussion. What are you prepared to give up? But never in a discussion that you're going to give it all up without a very clear definition. So correctness versus reasonableness, the whole discussion about the Oakes test and the responsibility of an independent judiciary to defend the charter rights, because the courts are there not to defend the government. The courts are there to defend the citizens of Canada.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really highlighted it for me is when you were saying abdicated responsibility, and I really think that is the biggest issue. Is everyone said hot potato, not my area of expertise, and I think what you and or Jeff Rath suggested was that experts have to come to the table with that thought out plan, because someone has to take responsibility. Somebody has to be accountable
And so
when you're
we
taking away
need to build it
rights.
in a way, because
Hmm.
I don't know if you read the works by Matthias Desmet on mass formation, but he's a Belgian
Mhm.
author who did some great work before COVID and during COVID, really refined it, published a book on mass formation, because mass formation happens to everybody. Okay, it doesn't just happen to a small fringe group. It doesn't just happen to a group of experts. It happens to everybody, including judges in courts, including
Yeah.
lawyers that testify in front. And so the terror built through propaganda by our governments during COVID to use fear as a weapon affected everybody. So judges were, so we have to put in place systems that are mandatory. And so for the courts, to me, the Oakes test was mandatory. And yet somehow they simply ignored it. And they should be held accountable today. Every judge that heard a case during COVID that didn't demand the Oakes test be applied when the complainant was talking about the removal of a charter right or freedom, every judge who did not invoke the Oakes test should be held accountable.
Yeah.
Every expert who didn't prove correctness with a cost-benefit analysis before making a decision to remove a charter right or freedom should be held accountable. And they should be held accountable for gross negligence because they were lazy. They didn't prove that wearing a mask would do would do less harm than good. They didn't prove that closing schools and the terrible impact of the loss of those charter rights on our children that will last them their whole lives, they were never asked to prove a cost-benefit analysis. So if you're going to deny a charter right or freedom, mass formation is going to happen in every emergency. And so what you have to do is build a system that defends your charter and rights and freedoms in times of emergency. It's easy on a sunny, clear day, you would think. But now that we can't walk in parks, I don't even agree with that. I don't believe that it's even easy on a sunny, clear day. I
Yeah.
think we need to go back and fundamentally talk about what are the rights and freedoms that Canadians believe they have or believe they want to have, and how do we ensure that those are defendable?
And so actually I was going to ask, did you want to go over the rights and freedoms that are identified in the charter and kind of talk through them, or
Well, we can, but I think it's more important in this kind of a higher level discussion about the six national interests that define a country to stay at a higher level, like I was taught as a young officer. But if we talk about, like I've got them here, freedom of conscience and religion, and everyone, it's always the ability of people to have the beliefs that they have while not impinging on others. And so as soon as we get into that kind of a discussion, I give you two examples. My family immigrated to Canada way back in the 1800s. One portion of my family, there's many legs of it that came here over time, but one portion of it came because they were being denied their charter, being denied the right to believe in God in their own way. And their way was Wesleyan. And the Church of England decreed that everyone had to be an Anglican, the High Church of England, in order to hold a public service job. And my grandfather, my great grandfather ran a school for boys, a Wesleyan school for boys. And so he either converted his religion or he lost his employment. So they came to Canada. And everybody always thinks about, all the different types of religions and all theirs. Well, that's a British example, right? And it happened all over Europe where Catholics and
Yeah.
Protestants and fled for whatever reason. That basic fundamental right, but freedom of conscience and freedom of religion comes in so many forms, but it never gives you the right. It's freedom from religion as well, because you can't ram your religion down any other religion's throat. And when you have a religion whose fundamental tenet is convert or die, that's completely against this right, which is defined in our charter. You can worship any God in your own way. And one of the things that always people came to me, even during counterterrorism, talking about religion. And I said, okay, which God? Because they always said, well, you've got to defend the belief in God. And I always just say, which God? I want a system that allows everyone to believe in a higher entity in any way they want, but don't tell me which God I have to focus on. I want people to be free to have worship whatever they wish to worship, as long as they don't try and deny it to someone else for a different form of religion, right? And the minute you get a religion that believes convert or die, you've broke the Canadian Charter. So that's one of the first ones. Freedom of thought, belief, opinion, expression, including the freedom of the press and other media. But the freedom of thought, belief, and opinion, we're really seeing in Canadian society an attempt to divide based on opinion. And all through the last decade, we saw people being censored, cancel culture, forced out of employment because their opinion different than the norm. You should be, Eva, I can't emphasize strongly enough, and the viewing audience that watches you knows you believe in open discussion over forced belief. And this entire reason we're doing these discussions is based on that people should have the right to have a fierce debate and discussion, but not imply physical violence or ostracization or removal of employment because you differ in beliefs. Now, we took a lot of time trying to define hate speech and what would incite violence, but we saw our own prime minister during COVID saying, these people are most likely misogynist and racist, and what are we going to do with these people? It sounded to me like an ancient king of England who said the same thing about an archbishop, which resulted in him being murdered. He was trying to incite violence against people who wouldn't get vaccinated. The whole idea of holding different thoughts and beliefs isn't wrong. That's what a democracy is founded on, the ability for open debate and discussion in the agora back in the times of Socrates. And the challenges against it have been going on since Socrates. They forced him to take poison because his beliefs were against the government. Isn't that a lesson? Don't we understand that overreach by anyone in authority against our charter rights and freedoms must be defended against? And so, as we go through each one of them, I always come back to the tenet. We either have to prove correctness on experts, or we have to have an independent legal system that actually enforces the Oakes test, which does exactly that. It makes them prove they've done the cost-benefit analysis, because nothing is ever perfectly right or wrong. There's always a balance. So show me the risk that you're talking about taking care of, and why it's necessary, even in the first place, to remove any charter rights or freedoms to mitigate that risk. And if you can't do that, then get out of here. But if you believe and can actually prove to me that there is a need to mitigate a right or a freedom, show me how you're going to do it for the minimum time, on the minimum portion of the population, in the minimum geographic area, and how fast you're going to take it back. And I will hold you accountable if you don't remove it immediately instead of
Yeah.
2.5 years later, only because of a freedom conflict.
Well, and the one thing I would add to the discussion about freedom of thought and not being canceled or losing your job is how can you even suggest it's a free society when you can't think or speak something? And that it just goes like right against having that conversation. So for me, and I said this last time, I think too, it's about educating. Maybe I feel like that's the issue that some people have is it's an uneducated or it's an unsophisticated opinion. Great. Okay, then let's talk it through. Let's talk about it. Let's educate. Let's elevate this conversation then. But all we're seeing, and I've said this, I think, many times, is elected officials also disparaging rather than being like, what is your grievance? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why you feel this way because they've also abdicated their responsibility.
Right.
Same like many I've been calling on the legal profession to elevate the conversation in this country, not lower it. And then, judges, some better than others. Really interesting to see how some of the judges are reacting and responding, but not everybody can abdicate and say, "Not my problem. Don't say that." And then we're in the position that we are right now as a result.
So going
And
back to all
yeah,
six national interests, and the one we want, the very one at the very bottom of the list of six as we're doing these discussions is individual and societal well-being and education. Your comment on education that you started there is we need to have that fulsome discussion in that six national interests because education at from kindergarten through to grade 12, the bachelor's degree, master's degree, skilled trades, the apprenticeship program. But the fundamental core at the very bottom of that whole education system is A, the family, and B, primary school. And we need to get back in our education process to breaking the terrible circle caused by helicopter parenting and bulldozer parenting. And I hate to keep coming back to it, but at the core of this whole discussion on rights and freedoms is this thought and belief that no Canadian citizen should ever be challenged in their life. That when there's a difficult situation, we pluck the child out of the difficult situation. We don't put the child intentionally in difficult situations and say, sink or swim, you know, but at age appropriate challenges. So that as they grow up, each challenge gets harder and harder and harder. And so by the time they're 18, they know they can stand on their own 2 feet and they can't wait to get out in the world and test out these abilities that they've been given by their parents and by a school system that educated them to be resilient in their own right, not when somebody protects and coddles them. And so the entire concept of rights and freedoms is based on a society that is prepared to defend them, that each individual goes, you can't do that to me. And then government won't overreach.
yeah,
Experts won't overreach because the public just goes, are you
no,
kidding me? You, but we have a society now that can't wait for a new restriction. That what I see on things like X and social media platforms, well, of course we're going to close all the forests because people cause forest fires. Yes. So why aren't you finding the arsonists? we had this in a previous discussion about the responsibility of leadership is to take care of the 5% of society who are pure evil and leave the 95% alone and allow them to live their lives. And so the same thing applies to rights and freedoms. You got to drill down and look for the offenders and remove them. And then the rest of society sees that the people that are damaging the rights and freedoms of our free and open democratic society are being dealt with. So justice must be done, it must be seen to be done, and it must continuously see that it's being done. Otherwise, every right and freedom, you end up in this situation that they're in right now, where over half the population is screaming for more restrictions because of a
Yeah.
heat wave. Instead of saying, stand up, deal with it, suck it up.
Yeah.
When I went to Egypt in 1978 into the middle of the Sinai Desert, no one said, "Oh, Dave, we really need to call you and hold you," and because it's 115 in the shade here every day, and I don't know if you can take it. So we have to find a way to help you and to mitigate the heat. They said, "Get out there, Lieutenant. You've got troops in the middle of the frickin' desert. Take care of them." All right.
Yeah.
The whole idea of self-accountability, self-responsibility, that we need to rebuild that. And so when we get to the discussion about individual and societal well-being, the first thing we have to do is to get back to a stronger, more resilient Canadian from birth to 18. And we'll find that many of the challenges we're experiencing today in terms of cancel culture and all the rest of it simply go away when people say, yeah, no, not on my watch.
Yeah. Well, and the one I think we'll get into this a bit more in the last six interest, but I think it is important in this conversation is when you started with your discussion about mom said, get out, and then whistle and you come back. The other thing that was coming to my mind was not just the individual responsibility of the person but who the parent is and who the disciplinarian and punisher was, because I think that's also an interesting conversation because parents have abdicated that role in many respects. Then it's become the teachers, then it became the experts, then it became the police, then it became, and then what you were saying is the neighbors were keeping an eye out. And that's how, when you have that kind of close-knit and people closest to the issue taking accountability and watching out, that's when it's easier to say no. Because when everybody's saying, well, I don't know, not my responsibility, not my issue, then of course somebody's going to swoop in and take that responsibility. And
So again, it's in the sixth interest, but right
yeah,
here, it's so important. The family unit. All right.
yeah,
Mother, father, whatever terms we have to use these days, a mom and a dad and their family and their kids and how they bring them up and the expectations of the parents. Because part of that, get out the door and do your own thing, also applied when I went to school. Like I walked to school on my own. And when I get there, I had a brother and sister and they quickly went past school. So I was always on my own in all the, junior high and all that. And, and so the basic principle was if you go to school, and you get in big trouble and the teacher has to discipline you, whatever happens at school is going to be 2 times worse when you get home because you've embarrassed the family. And
yeah,
so mom and dad totally supported the teacher. Now, if a teacher got out of line, there was ways in society that the teacher was brought back in line. But very rarely was the teacher wrong when children act out in class. There has to be the teacher has to be an authority role model and be allowed to discipline children in the classroom. But the understanding in my mind was it didn't matter what Mrs. Fraser did to me. It sure as hell happened what Dad was going to do when I got home, right? Because I was responsible for my actions, not the teacher. Not some random person who was advising me, not some expert in a field, me. And so when I got home, I had to justify what I had done. And if the teacher had disciplined me, it was pretty normal that I wasn't going to be able to justify what I'd done, and I was going to get a whooping, right? Dad knew his role, and it was to make sure that I respected proper authority, which was the teacher in my classroom, and didn't embarrass the family and didn't make it so the teacher had to take time away from teaching my whole class to deal with something stupid I'd done. Right.
Yeah.
And it happened in my life. And I learned that lesson. And I also learned the difference between corporate punishment for rights and freedoms and individual punishment. And I go back to the conversation we had in a previous about leadership's job is to find the 5% evil, because I was taught as a lieutenant, never use corporate punishment. So a definition for people that don't understand the term: someone in the platoon broke into stores and stole some cleaning materials. Two options: take the whole platoon, 37 soldiers, and put them on confined to barracks for the weekend, expecting them to turn in the culprit. Or do my job, investigate, find the culprit, punish them, put them on summary trial, and deal with them. If you use corporate punishment, what results is the people either shut up and go silent on you and never trust your leadership, or they slide over and side with the criminal. Because if they're going to be punished anyhow, why not not go to Safeway to buy the cleaning fluids, steal them out of stores with them, and that way you don't have to you do that expense. So corporate punishment always backfires. When you take a whole society and say, you can't walk in the forest because somebody is setting forest fires, you've just proven that you're not doing your job as a leader, which is to find the arsonists and then give them maximum jail terms, which will discourage anyone else from being an arsonist. And the good people go, the government's doing its job correctly. I support that government, and all my rights and freedoms are still in place, but I'm going to take extra care for the next 2 weeks while this heat wave is on. I'm going to make sure if I see anything smoldering in the forest, I immediately put it out. I don't just walk by and say, somebody else will take care of that. It's my job. I'll go to put that little smoldering leaf out, or that campfire that somebody walked away from. You use the public to be your eyes and ears. In counterterrorism, I wanted every Alberta to be my eyes and ears, not to be hiding in their house. If we thought there was a terrorist group moving through our province to a specific target, I wanted to be able to say it very publicly through an independent media, this is what we think they look like, this is where they're going, help us. Right?
Yeah.
So this whole idea of fundamental rights and freedoms, along with the freedom comes the responsibility. And the responsibility in the case of this forest fire thing is to help maintain the forest, to not be, in fact, instead of saying stay out of the forest, we should be banding together groups of citizens and saying, we need you to help us patrol the woods in case there's a lightning strike, in case there's the whole idea of emergency management, which I've strongly disagreed with in the past 10 years, is when a flood is coming, we evacuate people. When a fire is coming, we evacuate. All able-bodied personnel should be pre-trained and ready to step up to help fight the fire, to help fight the flood, not run away from the risk, be and therefore defend their own rights and freedoms by being present. No matter what the risk is, be present and defend your own rights and freedoms. So I always keep coming back to the concept of how do you hold experts accountable and how do you hold government accountable when they want to deny charter rights and freedoms. And so the independent courts with the Oakes test, the requirement to prove correctness. If you had to prove correctness, that it's correct to keep the entire public out of a forest, you can't do it.
Yeah.
And so we can carry on, right for freedom of assembly, the rights for freedom of association. All we're allowing now is for people that are screaming for the death of all Jews, all Christians, all Canadians to march in our streets. So we're defending the freedom of assembly, but only for some. And probably, if you look at our hate speech legislation, we're not enforcing the very rules that we're supposed to protect those fundamental rights of those people for freedom of conscience and religion. We're taking one group, the Jews and allowing them to be targeted in our streets using one of our rights, which is freedom of peaceful assembly, when the assembly goes past being peaceful. So
Yeah.
how do you ensure a system that walks through every one of those? And I come back to Red Skelton. My freedom and my rights end when they impact and deny rights and freedoms for another citizen. And so we have to find that balance. And nothing is ever black and white. The discussion I'm having with some of my grandchildren about the 256 shades of gray, white being absolute heaven and perfect, black being absolute evil. Every decision we make in our lives is somewhere on that scale. And sometimes we can get all the way down to something like 20 instead of 200. But
Yeah.
normally we're fighting somewhere in the middle between 100 and 150, trying to make decisions without full information and without full justification. But if we don't even try to determine more correctness or less correctness, more cost-benefit analysis doing less harm than good, we've just given up. And one of the basic, right at the very start of the charter, is citizens' responsibilities. So if you want rights and freedoms, you have to be responsible, accountable, and do your part to defend those rights and freedoms. We've had so many soldiers in the history of our country who died defending these rights and freedoms. Isn't it time that as individual citizens, we took their sacrifice more seriously? And I hate people that constantly jump back to that analogy, but the fact remains is Canada is the way Canada is because of people who have gone before us. And whether it was in conflict or whether it was standing up in courts or whether it was simply holding government to account, if you don't defend your rights and freedoms, totalitarian dictatorships will ultimately take over. Yeah, I mean, democracy will best satisfy, and the human thirst for freedom and rights falls time and time again to dictators and tyrants. It's an ancient Greek saying, because democracy was just evolving at the time and constantly failing. I think Canadians need to step back and really determine what rights and freedoms they believe they want in our country, how far they're prepared to go to defend them, and their understanding of their responsibilities versus the rights and freedoms that they believe that they can cherry pick at any given time. But we need to also put it into our institutions to ensure that no one can take away a right or freedom unless justifying exactly for who, for how long, in what geographic area, how quickly it'll be removed, with a full justification that it will do less harm than good.
And I like that we're doing the higher level discussion. And when you were talking about your Redman,
Red Skelton, he was a
Red
comedian.
yeah,
You can tell I'm
before
older.
my time. Yeah.
He was very
Uh,
famous.
But the quote that I heard quite a bit was, "Your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins." And I think that's a similar one. So I think we've gone through the discussion about rights quite a bit. I think it's obviously a discussion that we need to be having as Canadians, as citizens. But maybe let's talk a little bit more about citizens' responsibilities, because you touched on a few of those. So because I think maybe this is another thing citizens are kind of grappling with right now, because they have been incredibly apathetic. It went from a lot of apathy to the largest civic disobedience movement in Canadian history. And then I think since then, Canadians have been trying to figure out what their role is and why the government isn't doing what I said on Twitter. So there's maybe a little bit of a discussion we can have there as well.
Your book, Reconnect with Canada, it defines very clearly what our system is, but it also has a whole chapter on how to get citizens to reconnect with the governance that they live in. And if citizens have all the power, they can vote out an elected official at the next election. They choose not to, and for many reasons. But if they don't take responsibility and use all the levers at their disposal, when they believe that charter rights and freedoms, first of all, everybody download a copy of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's free of charge. It's on the Government of Canada website. Download it and actually read it and understand it. And if you don't understand it, reach out to somebody like yourself and have a discussion about what that charter right actually means, right? Have that fulsome discussion. Then, if you believe that a charter right or freedom is not being correctly administered in our country, stand up, open your mouth, write to your MLA, your MPP, your MP, write to your councillor, attend council meetings, attend the provincial legislature, go and make your voice heard through emails, phone calls, legal and rightful protest, peaceful assembly, which you have the right to do under your charter rights. Make sure the governance associations, and I include our courts, hear you, hear your disappointment in a legal, respectful way. So when people go on X and start using cuss words and swear words against the government or else, you know you've lost their attention. Do it in a proper manner that they can't just ignore. Make it so that it's repetitive. Make sure that as a citizen, you express extreme displeasure when a right or a freedom is removed without a definition of exactly who, for how long, in what geographic area, when it will be lifted, but with a complete cost-benefit analysis published transparently saying why it's even necessary. And if the logic of why doesn't stand up, then that's what you're going after. You're going after the why first, and then exactly who. Corporate punishment never works. It should never be done. And yet we've seen it done repeatedly in the last 10 years, either through actual actions by our government or through cancel culture or through. So it's not just government you're going after. It's our universities that are canceling professors and canceling the ability of free speech on campuses when they cancel religious singers coming to hold gospel sessions in our country. And it's being done by every type of institution, from government all the way down to the community hall, are banning these people because they're afraid there might be a riot. When there's actual riots happening in our streets by people screaming for the death of all Jews, all Canadians, and all Christians, we're actually preemptively stopping someone from actually doing one of their charter rights, which is freedom of conscience and religious expression. I mean, we as citizens have to re-engage, and we need to reconnect with our charter rights and freedoms. We need to read the document, understand the consequences of losing it, because each step that we take, no matter whether you're going left or right, only ends up in one place: dictatorship. And if anyone hasn't read 1984, they need to. I mean, it doesn't matter what form of government, when you end up at the bottom in a dictatorship, the horrors that happen in a dictatorship. There's a movie my wife and I just watched on Friday night. It's called I'm Still Standing. And it was when the military overthrow in Brazil happened and what happened to people that vanished. And the powers of government when rights and freedoms cease to exist in any country, a previous democracy that becomes, and the only way out of it routinely is with weapons. The only way to break out of a dictatorship goes to civil war instead of civil unrest. And you know, through many of our discussions, that the places I've been in my life, I've seen what civil war looks like. I've seen the horrors that happen in a civil war and the outcomes of a civil war trying to get back your rights and freedoms never end up where you thought they would. The Civil War never turns out well. It just turns out with hundreds of thousands of dead people. So we still have our democracy. It's time for us to demand, as citizens, through every one of the actions we can take, contacting elected officials, contacting industry, contacting other institutions like universities, when we are displeased with the removal of our charter rights and freedoms. So start by educating yourself what they are, use the correct terms, be polite and respectful, but be tenacious.
Yeah, I so much agree with that, 100%, because and that's where I'm like the most sad about what's going on in Canada is that rather than, even now, like I'll say something, um, and it's just on social media, and maybe I haven't expressed it so well, or maybe I don't understand it completely or at all. And then what I see is somebody from the other side, rather than being like, Eva, you kind of screwed that up there. It's like, what a ditz you are. How did you even get a law degree? And to me, it just is junior high. And it's embarrassing that as a society, as adults in Canada, we're acting like junior high children. And I see professionals I see lawyers doing it. And it's embarrassing to me in this country that's
If
what we've
someone
stooped
can't
down to.
attack your policy or the position you've expressed, and instead chooses to attack you as an individual, and I don't mean you, I mean in any situation, when you see politicians attacking groups of
Yeah,
people with character assassination, or universities attacking people with character assassination, instead of attacking the principle that they're presenting, they have no justification for their action.
yeah,
If they can actually hold a meaningful discussion about the point you're making, they're worth engaging with. But if they're attacking you as a person, if they're attacking with individual targeted attacks on the personality, the looks, the religion, they have no justification for the charter right or freedom they're trying to deny, or the discussion that you're trying to have, because that's what dictators do. They
yeah.
simply attack the individual, not the point, because they can't attack the point. It would prove that they're wrong.
Yeah, and I think this goes like a great way to end too is a reminder that keep talking about principle, keep talking about what your values are, why you want to defend your rights and freedoms. And don't engage in that noise because it is noise and it's a waste of time. So people often think too when I say dialogue over division, it means being nice to people that are mean to me. And I'm like, not at all. Like I want to have a discussion with people that are going to have reasonable discussions with me, but I'm not going to participate in the junior high
Character
theatrics.
assassination.
Yeah, like I've been through junior high. I'm not interested in going back. So that's to me is not dialogue. But certainly I think there's room for that. But I don't see our leaders doing it. So I'm hoping to be an example. And I think this
Well,
is
the
already
name of
proven
your
to be.
group, Dialogue Over Division, is exactly what you're trying to achieve. You want
Yeah.
dialogue, and we're in
Yeah.
times
Well,
of division, and we want to debate the issues, not the
yeah.
personalities.
Yeah. And like, let's have a conversation about these rights. Like that's what we have why we have these. We're supposed to be living in a free and democratic society. So the point is to refine them and talk about them and challenge them and debate them. Like that's the whole fun of the free and democratic society, in
Sometimes
my
not fun,
opinion.
but necessary.
Yeah. Well, the debating part could be fun. Not all the
You're a
dirty,
lawyer.
messy.
You love debate.
I know. You noticed, hey? Um, but anyway, that was great. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to wrap up with on this
No,
one, but I think
just to say, always remember when we're into these discussions of the individual parts of the six national interests, all six fit together in unity and national security, overarching. You can't even have a country without them, and we've discussed
yeah,
them in detail. Good governance, so important in democracy. And what is the good governance for? It's for rights and freedoms, which makes the democracy real. And we'll get the other two later. The whole idea of economic prosperity and growth to fund your democracy and societal and individual well-being. How you continuously renew and regenerate the next society, the next group of citizens into your society. And so it all comes back to the need to be able to have meaningful discussion with our political leadership today using the six national interests as the format to give you a platform to discuss with your politicians your expectations of a very clearly articulated 25-year vision for our country, and that no politician should be allowed to be a leader in our country if they can't express a clear 25-year vision and can't express how they intend to achieve it through the definition of 6 national interests, all of which is in the paper on the Frontier Center for Public Policy, Canada 2024, confident, resilient nation or a fearful, fractured country. And so we need the discussion, but we need the discussion to be framed in a meaningful way. And that's why I wrote the paper, to try and give people who have a different background the ability to grab terms and words and have a meaningful dialogue with their elected officials, because we need it so desperately right now.
Agreed. Yeah. Well, great way to end it. Let's just keep the dialogue going, elevating the conversation because we desperately need it. Couldn't agree more. Thank you again for your time in this
Thank you again for
discussion.
having this, Eva.